When the music died, the heartbreaking end of Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy Osbourne was born on December 3, 1948, in the tough working-class neighborhood of Aston, Birmingham, England. It was a cold winter morning, the kind of day when the gray skies hung low and the factory smoke never seemed to clear. Birmingham in those post-war years wasn't a place for dreamers. It was a city of noise, steel clanging, furnaces roaring, men trudging home in soot-stained overalls. And in the middle of it all was a small boy who would one day be called the Prince of Darkness. Ozzy's father, John Thomas Osbourne, worked long, punishing hours as a toolmaker at General Electric, while his mother, Lillian Osbourne, kept the family afloat with part-time work at a factory. The Osbournes weren't rich, not even close. Money was tight, meals were simple, and every penny had a purpose. But what the family lacked in wealth, they made up for in grit and spirit. Ozzy grew up in a cramped two-bedroom house shared with 5 siblings, 3 older sisters, Jean, Iris, and Jillian, and 2 younger brothers, Paul and Tony. The house was always full of noise, laughter, arguments, music, and sometimes silence when there wasn't enough to eat. Ozzy's childhood wasn't one of comfort or calm. He struggled in school, not because he didn't care, but because the world inside a classroom never seemed to make sense to him. Later in life, he'd discover he was dyslexic, but back then, teachers just called him slow. It was a label that stuck and stung. They thought I was thick, Ozzy once said, remembering the shame of sitting at his desk while the world moved faster than he could read it. But even then, deep inside that awkward, confused boy was a spark, a sense that he was meant for something more. Despite his academic struggles, Ozzy found comfort in performing. He loved to make people laugh, often becoming the class clown just to hear the sound of joy echo through a room that otherwise made him feel small. He'd mimic teachers, tell silly stories, and even sing snippets of songs to get attention. Somewhere between the jokes and the chaos, a young dream began to form, the dream of standing in front of people, not as the slow kid, but as someone who mattered. At home, his father was strict but caring, a man who believed in hard work above all else. His mother, Lillian, was the emotional heart of the family, protective, proud, and determined to keep her children on the right path. Still, the streets of Aston had a pull of their own. Crime, poverty, and hopelessness were part of daily life. Many of Ozzy's childhood friends ended up in trouble, and for a time, he wasn't much different. He drifted, searching for meaning, getting into small-time mischief, trying to find his place in a world that didn't seem to have one for him. Music became his escape. It was the one thing that made sense. He would listen to records by the Beatles, Little Richard, and the Rolling Stones, artists who turned pain into power and dreams into sound. When Ozzy first heard the Beatles' song She Loves You, something clicked inside him. That was it for me, he later said. I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a Beatle. It sounded ridiculous to everyone else, a poor boy from Birmingham dreaming of fame and freedom, but for Ozzy, it wasn't just fantasy. It was survival. As he reached his teenage years, Ozzy tried different jobs, plumbing, laboring, even working in a slaughterhouse, but nothing fit. The grind of factory life felt like a slow death, and every day behind those gray walls made him more desperate to escape. By his late teens, that desperation turned reckless. Ozzy got into petty crime, stealing clothes, bikes, anything he could sell to make a quick pound. But his luck ran out fast. He was caught and sentenced to serve time at Winson Green Prison in Birmingham. It was a short sentence, but the experience left a scar that never faded. That was the worst time of my life, Ozzy later said. The smell, the noise, the fear, I knew I never wanted to go back. That short, dark chapter taught him a lesson. If he didn't find a way out soon, life would swallow him whole. And so, when he walked out of those prison gates, Ozzy didn't just walk free, he walked toward destiny. Somewhere, in the haze of factory smoke and guitar feedback, the future Prince of Darkness was being born. When Ozzy Osbourne left prison, he was broke, restless, and searching for purpose. Birmingham's gray skies still loomed over him, but inside, something had changed. The months he'd spent behind bars had shown him what rock bottom really looked like, and he wanted out. He didn't have a plan, not yet, but he had a dream and a voice that wouldn't stay silent. Not long after his release, Ozzy saw an old notice in a local music shop window. Singer wanted for band, must have own equipment. He didn't have any equipment, not even a microphone, but he had determination. With a bit of creativity, he scrawled his own message beneath the ad. Ozzy Zig needs a gig, has own P. It was partly a joke, partly a hope. That simple note would change his life. A few days later, a tall, serious-looking guitarist named Tony Iommi and his drummer friend Bill Ward came knocking at Ozzy's door. They knew him from the neighborhood but didn't expect much. Tony had gone to the same school as Ozzy and remembered him as the goofy kid who always seemed to be in trouble. "You? A singer?" Tony asked, almost laughing. But when Ozzy started to sing, something clicked. His voice, raw, eerie, and emotional, had something they hadn't heard before. Soon, the group formed what would become one of the most important rock bands in history. They started out under the name Polka Tulk Blues Band, a rough blues outfit that didn't quite stand out. Later, they became Earth, but everything changed the day they stumbled upon a small movie theater in Birmingham showing a horror film called Black Sabbath. The audience lined up outside made them think people paid money to be scared. Why not do that with music? From that strange inspiration, Black Sabbath was born. It wasn't just the name that shifted, it was the sound. Tony Iommi's guitar, dark and heavy, came from necessity. After an industrial accident at his factory job, he lost the tips of two fingers. To keep playing, he used lighter strings and tuned his guitar down, creating a low, haunting tone. That accident, paired with Ozzy's haunting vocals, would define the sound of heavy metal itself. Ozzy, Tony, Bill, and bassist Geezer Butler began crafting songs that reflected the world they knew, a place filled with war, fear, and working-class pain. Their music wasn't about pretty dreams or love stories. It was about reality, the darkness in the human heart, the violence of the streets, and the questions no one wanted to ask. When they played together, something electric happened. Ozzy's voice soared like a warning siren over Tony's monstrous riffs, Geezer's thunderous bass, and Bill's pounding drums. They were loud, unapologetic, and frighteningly good. Their self-titled debut album, Black Sabbath, released on February 13, 1970, a Friday the 13th, fittingly was like nothing the world had ever heard. Critics dismissed it as noise, but the fans felt something different. They heard truth. They heard power. The title track began with the sound of a distant storm, the tolling of a bell, and then that riff, dark, heavy, and unforgettable. When Ozzy sang the opening line, "What is this that stands before me?" it was like the voice of a prophet calling out from the shadows. Black Sabbath didn't just play music. They created a new language of rebellion and fear. The band's rise was explosive. Within months, they were headlining shows across Britain, and soon after, America came calling. Their second album, Paranoid 1970, turned them into global icons. With songs like Iron Man, War Pigs, and the immortal Paranoid, they gave a generation a soundtrack for its anger and confusion. Ozzy became the face of it all, wild, unpredictable, and magnetic. He wasn't a polished frontman. He was real. On stage, he screamed, howled, and moved like a man possessed. He wasn't pretending to be the Prince of Darkness. He was the Prince of Darkness, and audiences loved every second of it. But behind the chaos and fame, something darker was growing. The fame came fast, and so did the pressure. Constant touring, endless parties, and the relentless expectations of success began to weigh on the band and on Ozzy most of all. He started drinking heavily, using drugs to numb the exhaustion and anxiety that fame brought. At first, it felt like part of the rock and roll lifestyle, a badge of rebellion. But as the years went on, it became a cage. Still, at this point in the early 70s, Ozzy Osbourne was unstoppable. From the grimy streets of Birmingham, he had risen to become the voice of a generation. A kid who once failed in school was now leading one of the loudest, most controversial bands on earth. What began as four working-class men chasing a dream had turned into something larger, a movement. A new kind of music that would echo for generations. But while the world called him a rock god, Ozzy was slowly losing control of the very thing he'd created. The fame that lifted him was also beginning to destroy him. By the mid-1970s, Black Sabbath was at the height of its power. Their albums Master of Reality, Vol. 4, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and Sabotage had cemented their place as the fathers of heavy metal. Stadiums were packed, records were selling by the millions, and the band's dark image made them both feared and worshipped. But behind the screaming fans and thunderous guitars, the cracks were starting to show. Success, it turned out, was a double-edged sword. The endless tours, the chaotic schedules, and the pressure to keep creating hit after hit pushed the band to its breaking point. Ozzy, once the unpredictable heart of Sabbath, was spiraling deeper into a lifestyle that mixed wildness with despair. Drugs and alcohol weren't just temptations anymore, they were survival tools. Cocaine, whiskey, and pills became part of his daily routine. Every night on tour blurred into the next. The music, the crowds, the fame, it was all beginning to lose its color. Ozzy had always been sensitive beneath the wild image. He carried insecurities from his childhood, wounds that fame couldn't heal. And instead of facing them, he drowned them. "I drank to stop feeling," he once admitted. "But the more I drank, the worse I felt." Recording sessions grew chaotic. While Tony Iommi and Geezer Butler tried to steer the band's direction, Ozzy became detached, lost in his addictions and exhaustion. The band's once unified energy was now splintered into frustration and resentment. By 1978, during the making of Never Say Die, it was clear something had changed. Ozzy's performances were erratic, his voice strained, his focus gone. Even he knew it. "I didn't want to sing anymore," he later confessed. "I was done." Then came the moment that changed everything. In 1979, after more than a decade together, the unthinkable happened. Ozzy Osbourne was fired from Black Sabbath. For Ozzy, it was like the world had ended. The band that had lifted him from the slums of Birmingham, the brothers he'd shared every dream and nightmare with, they were now moving on without him. He was replaced by Ronnie James Dio, a decision that sent Ozzy into a tailspin. He locked himself away in a darkened hotel room in Los Angeles, drowning in depression and self-pity. Days turned into weeks as he drank himself toward oblivion. "I thought I was finished," he said later. "No band, no friends, no reason to get out of bed. I was done with life." At that point, Ozzy wasn't the Prince of Darkness, he was just John Osbourne again, the scared boy from Aston who had lost his way. But fate wasn't done with him yet. In that same city, a woman named Sharon Arden, the daughter of music manager Don Arden, saw something in him that no one else did. She believed Ozzy still had magic left. Sharon had known him from the early Sabbath days, and despite his chaos, she refused to give up on him. She visited him in that dark hotel room, surrounded by bottles and despair, and made him an offer that would change his life. "Get up," she told him. "You're not done yet." With her help, Ozzy began to claw his way back. Sharon became not just his manager, but the anchor that kept him from drifting away completely. She pushed him to start a solo career, something Ozzy himself didn't believe was possible. He'd been kicked out of one of the biggest bands in the world. Everyone thought he was finished, but Sharon saw the spark still flickering inside him. Together, they started over. In 1980, Ozzy released Blizzard of Oz, his first solo album, and against all odds, it was a masterpiece. Songs like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley turned him from a fallen star into a rock legend reborn. His voice was sharper, his energy wild again, and his stage presence unlike anything the world had ever seen. But even as the crowd roared and his career came back to life, the darkness inside him never completely went away. Addiction still followed him like a shadow. Ozzy was winning again, but the battle with himself was far from over. When Blizzard of Oz hit the airwaves in 1980, it was like lightning striking twice. Few believed that Ozzy Osbourne could come back from the wreckage of Black Sabbath, not after the drugs, the breakdowns, and the public humiliation of being fired from his own band. But with Sharon Arden by his side and a group of fresh, fearless musicians behind him, Ozzy did what no one expected. He reinvented himself. The center of this rebirth was Randy Rhoads, a young guitarist whose talent bordered on supernatural. Only 23 years old, Randy brought something to Ozzy's music that no one else could: elegance. His guitar playing wasn't just fast. It was emotional, melodic, almost classical in its precision. Ozzy often said that Randy saved his life, and in many ways he did. Together, they created a sound that was both heavy and beautiful. Blizzard of Oz and the follow-up Diary of a Madman weren't just records, they were resurrection stories. Songs like Crazy Train, Mr. Crowley, and Flying High Again became anthems, proof that Ozzy was more than a frontman from an old band. He was a force of nature, but as the music soared, so did the chaos behind it. Life on the road was a blur of loud nights, wild crowds, and endless temptation. Ozzy was still battling his demons, and even Sharon's steady hand couldn't always keep him in control. He was brilliant on stage, but self-destructive off it. He drank to celebrate, to forget, and sometimes just to feel alive. Yet through it all, Sharon believed in him. Their relationship wasn't easy, it was fiery, emotional, and filled with both passion and pain. Sharon was strong-willed, unafraid to stand up to Ozzy, even when he spiraled. And he needed that strength. Without her, many say Ozzy might not have survived the decade. Then, in March 1982, tragedy struck. The band was in Florida touring for Diary of a Madman. Between shows, they stopped at a small airfield. The group's bus driver, who had some flying experience, decided to take a small plane up for fun. He took Randy Rhoads and one of the crew members along for the ride. It was meant to be a quick flight, just a few minutes of air before heading to the next show, but what happened next shattered Ozzy's world forever. The plane clipped the band's tour bus during a low pass and crashed into a nearby house, exploding in flames. Randy Rhoads, the young genius who had helped rebuild Ozzy's life, was gone instantly. He was only 25. Ozzy was devastated. He rushed to the wreckage, screaming, unable to believe what he was seeing. It was like losing a son, he said later, his voice breaking. Randy wasn't just my guitarist. He was my family. For weeks, Ozzy could barely function. The tour stopped. The music stopped. The laughter, the madness, all of it faded into silence. He'd fought so hard to come back, only to lose the one person who made him believe it was possible. But somehow, through the grief, Sharon kept him moving. She helped him face the stage again, helped him turn that pain into performance. Each night he sang, the sorrow bled through his voice, and the fans, loyal, emotional, and raw, felt it with him. That year, Ozzy married Sharon. It wasn't a fairy tale wedding, it was two broken souls choosing to fight life together. They married in Maui, away from the noise and the chaos, a quiet moment of peace between storms. Over the next few years, Ozzy's solo career grew even bigger. Bark at the Moon 1983, The Ultimate Sin 1986, and No Rest for the Wicked 1988 all became major successes. He was now a global icon, his image, wild hair, eyeliner, and that unmistakable snarl turning him into something larger than life. But fame has a price, and Ozzy's demons never truly left. The alcohol, the drugs, the inner voices, they haunted him like old friends who refused to leave. I was living two lives, he admitted. Ozzy, the legend on stage, and John Osbourne, the lost man, off it. Through all of it, Sharon stood firm, sometimes as his protector, sometimes as his opponent, but always as his anchor. Their love wasn't perfect. It was messy, loud, and often painful. But it was real. By the end of the 80s, Ozzy had become a symbol not just of heavy metal, but of survival itself. The boy from Birmingham who was told he'd never amount to anything was now one of the most recognized faces in rock history. Yet even as the world celebrated him, a quiet sadness began to creep into his eyes. He'd seen too much, lost too much, and fought too many battles, most of them with himself. But for Ozzy, the show always went on. No matter how broken he was inside, he'd walk on stage, flash that wild grin, and scream to the heavens, a man who refused to die. Even when death had already brushed past him, the 1,990 seconds began with a strange calm in Ozzy's storm. He had survived the chaos of the 80s, buried too many friends, and almost buried himself along the way. But in the quiet moments between tours, he started to face a terrifying truth. He didn't know who he was without the madness. Drugs and alcohol had been his armor for decades. They dulled the pain, blurred the guilt, and made him feel invincible. But now, with Sharon urging him toward sobriety, Ozzy found himself staring into a mirror and not recognizing the man looking back. "I had to meet myself for the first time," he once said, "and I didn't like what I saw." In 1991, Ozzy released No More Tears, one of his most personal albums ever. The title track and songs like Mama, I'm Coming Home felt like letters written to his own soul. For the first time, the Prince of Darkness was letting the world see his heart. The album became a massive success, earning him a Grammy nomination and proving that he could evolve without losing his edge. But even as his music matured, the old shadows refused to fade. Ozzy's addictions were relentless. He would get sober for months, even years, only to slip again, one drink, one bad night, one relapse at a time. Sharon fought beside him through every breakdown, every hospital stay, every whispered rumor of overdose. "I never wanted to give up on him," she said, "because somewhere under all the madness, there was still my husband, the man I fell in love with." Their home life was as unpredictable as Ozzy himself. Sharon was managing his career, raising their children Amy, Kelly, and Jack, while also keeping Ozzy's chaos under control. The Osbourne house was a battlefield of love, laughter, and insanity. By the late 90s, Ozzy had become an unlikely elder statesman of heavy metal. Younger bands like Metallica and Slipknot called him a godfather. Yet behind the fame, he was just trying to hold it all together. Then, in 2002, something happened that no one expected. Ozzy became a TV star. The Osbournes premiered on MTV, showing the world the real Osbourne family, unfiltered, hilarious, and completely chaotic. Viewers couldn't get enough. Ozzy, stumbling around in his slippers, mumbling through his sentences, became a global sensation all over again. It was raw, it was real, and it made Ozzy more human than ever before. The show was funny, yes, but it also revealed the cracks beneath the laughter. Fans saw a man who had lived too hard, who couldn't always remember his words, who struggled to control his addictions even with cameras rolling. But they also saw love, the fierce love of a family that refused to give up on each other. Ozzy didn't just survive his demons, he started learning to live with them. "You can't kill the darkness," he once said, half joking. "You just learn to keep it on a leash." In the years that followed, Ozzy's story became one of endurance. He kept making music. Down to Earth 2001, Black Rain 2007, Scream 2010, and Ordinary Man 2020. He even reunited with Black Sabbath, bringing the band that started it all back together for one last, thunderous farewell tour, but his body had taken a beating. Years of touring, accidents, and surgeries left him in constant pain. In 2019, he suffered a serious fall at home that left him nearly paralyzed. Then came a Parkinson's diagnosis, a cruel twist for a man whose entire life had been defined by energy, chaos, and movement. Ozzy didn't hide from it. He faced it like he faced everything, with brutal honesty and a twisted sense of humor. "I'm not dying yet," he said, "but I'm getting closer every day. And I'm not afraid." Even in his late 70s, Ozzy kept recording, kept performing, kept fighting. His voice grew rougher, his body weaker, but the fire never went out. He spoke openly about death, not with fear, but with strange peace. "I've done it all," he told an interviewer. "I've loved, I've lost, I've been crazy, I've been blessed. When I go, I just hope they play something loud," and that's what makes Ozzy Osbourne's story so haunting, so unforgettable. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't a saint. He was a man who lived every day like it was his last, a survivor who turned pain into power, madness into music. Today, as the world watches him slow down, there's a sadness in the air, like the echo of a final guitar note fading into silence. But there's also pride, because Ozzy didn't just make heavy metal, he was heavy metal. The Prince of Darkness showed us that even in the darkest corners of life, you can still find rhythm, still find purpose, still find light, and when the music finally stops, the legend of Ozzy Osbourne will never truly die. By the time the 2020s arrived, Ozzy Osbourne had already lived 10 lifetimes in one. The boy from Birmingham who once stole car parts just to survive had become a global legend, adored by millions. Yet behind the fame, his body was quietly surrendering to time. Years of stage dives, drug abuse, and endless touring had left their marks: fractures, nerve damage, surgeries, and now Parkinson's disease. For most people, that would have been enough to call it quits. But Ozzy wasn't most people. "I don't know how to stop," he once laughed in an interview. "If I stop, I'll die." Even when he could barely stand for long, Ozzy kept recording. In 2020, Ordinary Man was released, a hauntingly beautiful reflection of his journey. Songs like Under the Graveyard and Goodbye felt like confessions, like a man making peace with his past. The album wasn't just music. It was his soul laid bare. Fans around the world felt it too. The same man who once bit the head off a bat was now writing lyrics about mortality, forgiveness, and love. The Prince of Darkness had grown old but not weak. His voice, though raspier, still carried the weight of 1,000 battles fought and survived. Then came 2023, and with it, a heartbreak no fan was ready for. Ozzy announced that his touring days were officially over. His spine couldn't take it anymore. "I'm not physically capable," he said, his voice trembling. "I never wanted to disappoint my fans, but my body just can't do it." It was like the world stopped for a moment. The man who never stopped screaming, who never stopped fighting, was finally saying goodbye to the stage. Fans flooded social media with tears, love, and gratitude. They didn't see a rock star stepping away, they saw a warrior finally laying down his armor. But even then, Ozzy couldn't stay silent. In 2024, he appeared unexpectedly at the Power Trip Festival, frail, trembling, but determined. With Sharon watching from the wings, he walked onto the stage, looked at the crowd, and whispered, "This is home." The roar that followed could be heard for miles. For a few fleeting minutes, the years melted away. Ozzy sang with every ounce of strength left in him, his voice cracked, his body weak, but his spirit unbreakable. It was a farewell no one would forget. After that, Ozzy retreated to his home in Buckinghamshire, England. The same man who once terrified the world, now surrounded by family, laughter, and quiet. Sharon stood by him as she always had. His children Kelly, Jack, and Amy visited often. He spent his days reflecting, writing, and sometimes just sitting by the window, staring out into the gray English sky. I used to think I'd die young, he said softly once. But maybe God wanted me to see what it's like to live this long just so I'd appreciate it. There's something haunting about seeing a man like Ozzy grow old. The chaos is gone, the screams have faded, but that spark, that wild, defiant fire still flickers in his eyes, and that's the magic of him. Ozzy Osbourne never pretended to be perfect. He was messy, flawed, addicted, and human. But he lived his truth so loudly that the world couldn't look away. Every scar, every loss, every mistake, they became part of his legend. He once said, "You can't kill rock and roll." And maybe that's true, because as long as people play his songs, Crazy Train, Dreamer, Iron Man, Mama I'm Coming Home, Ozzy will live on. When his voice finally falls silent, his spirit will still echo in the dark corners of every concert hall, every teenager learning guitar, every dreamer who refuses to quit, because Ozzy didn't just sing about madness, he survived it. So when the music dies, when the lights fade and the crowd goes quiet, we'll still remember the man who showed us that no matter how lost you are, no matter how broken life makes you, you can still rise, you can still fight, and you can still shine. Ozzy Osbourne may have taken his final bow, but the legend, that will never fade. In his last year, Ozzy spent most of his time at home in Los Angeles with Sharon. The noise was gone. The chaos, the parties, the lights, all replaced by quiet mornings and warm family dinners. He would sit by the window, look out at the California sun, and hum old Sabbath riffs. Sometimes he'd whisper lyrics from Changes. His voice was weak, but his eyes still carried that spark, the one that refused to die. He'd often joke, "I'm still the Prince of Darkness, love, just slower." Everyone would laugh, but deep down, they knew the end was near. And then, in late 2025, the world lost one of its loudest souls. Ozzy Osbourne passed away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by Sharon and his children. He was 76 years old.